Neon White is a game that wants you to complete its levels as fast as possible, but then it wants you to complete them again, then again, and again, and again, and you keep going until you start to view the levels in the game as a series of abstract geometry you've learned to weave your way around with a ridiculous amount of precision, and you'll feel damn good doing it. You know how it seems like just about every game has a speedrunning community developed around it, despite the developers never really intending for there to be one? Well, the Neon White creators caught an eye to that and decided, why not just make a game where speedrunning is the entire core idea? And they stuck close to that core philosophy in the final product. This is Neon White, a speedrunner's dream game. It's rare to see a game from a developer that isn't Nintendo that feels as tightly focused in its design as Neon White. There's very little fluff in the game, and what is there tends to be optional. Every level, every design, every mechanic, just about everything in this game feeds back into the idea that this is a game where you try to beat a level as fast as you possibly can. And this isn't a case where to achieve this discipline in game design, the developers had to keep things simple and safe. There's a surprising amount of depth and variety to be found in Neon White. From its enemy types to its weapons, the game is a symphony of ideas which work in perfect harmony to provide its incredibly fun experience. The core gameplay loop is simple and easy to understand. The game is made up of a bunch of levels, each with their own leaderboard to track your time. Within a level, your goal is to get to the finish line, but to finish a level, you must also kill every enemy within it. I put enemy in quotations there because the demons of this game aren't like a traditional foe in an FPS campaign. Instead, they stand perfectly still and are rarely a direct threat to the player. Rather, they are just an additional element to the puzzle design of Neon White's levels. To defeat these enemies, you'll need to make use of the weapon cards placed throughout the level. There are a few possible weapons you could find depending on the map, and each come with a bonus discard ability such as a double jump for the pistol or a dash for the sniper. Once you've killed every enemy, just touch the goal and the level is over. Now, if Neon White were a traditional FPS, it would be a pretty poor excuse for a game. But this is a game about speedrunning. So just because you beat a level doesn't mean it's over. You'll want to go back and do it again. Maybe this time you'll find a more optimal route, an opportunity to use the discard ability, a better way to exploit a piece of the level geometry, or perhaps something as simple as an easier shot on an enemy so you waste less time killing them. There's so much opportunity in every level to save time in completing it. There are two sides to Neon White, which feed into each other to form a satisfying gameplay loop. The first is the puzzle aspect, in which you meticulously study a level, finding any possible way to reduce your time beating it. When you do find a great save, you'll put it into practice in the other side of the game, the parkour FPS. Here, knowing an optimal route won't guarantee you a great time. You're expected to demonstrate your skills in movement and shooting as you glide through the environment, avoiding slowing down as much as possible. I'd like to take a bit of time to dissect these two parts of the game further, starting with the puzzle side. There are a lot of variables that come into play in each level in Neon White, but if I had to break them down into categories, they would be enemies, weapons, and level design. Within each of these categories is a list of variables which all drastically impact how a level is played. For instance, some enemies pose more of a threat to the player than others, particularly these heads which can shoot lasers which one hit kill you, whereas others would be better described as being an indirect threat, like the bubbles which aren't affected by guns, forcing you to pop them by physically entering them. Speaking of guns, they of course have a pretty significant role in how each level is played. Each has a list of pros and cons for both their shooting style and also their discard abilities. Starting with their purpose as, well, guns, prioritizing which to use is a decision that must be made on a level-to-level basis. While there are times where the range of a sniper can cut out extremely long sections of a run, sometimes the fire rate of the less accurate assault rifle is of greater use, but more importantly are their discard abilities. Each can make a drastic difference in how a level is beaten and are almost always involved in the more complex shortcuts of a route. But since these abilities are only triggered through discarding, you must also consider whether you can afford to lose your weapon. Remember, every enemy must be killed before you finish the level. Just because a double jump may skip a huge chunk of the mission, doesn't mean it's a viable option if you find yourself having to slowly melee the enemies in your path. And lastly, of course, is the level design. Each level is crafted with a clear and intended way to complete it on your first go. But from there, you're expected to find and exploit shortcuts, both developer intended and unintended, to beat the course as fast as you can. you'll frequently have to consider the layout of the level, including environmental factors like water which can make you move faster, or explosive barrels which can launch you. Sometimes, levels can be quite deceptive in their complexity. You'll initially assume you must experience most of what the developers have created, only to discover it's possible to ignore all their hard work and just skip 90% of the map. Now obviously these variables don't exist in a vacuum. Like almost everything in this game, they are perfectly intertwined with each other and are equally important factors to consider when running a level. So for instance, some enemies will drop weapon cards for the player to pick up, meaning the order in which you kill demons may change to prioritize grabbing their fallen loot. Additionally, since their health bars vary, what weapons you use against certain enemies is an important factor to consider as well. In a game about saving time, wasting seconds shooting the enemy with the wrong weapon is a mistake you can't afford to make. Then you have certain enemies which are almost better fitted into the level design category, like these balloons and launch pads, which give you a boost vertically and horizontally respectively. The laser beams also seem to blur the lines between categories, albeit in a way that is either helpful for the player or sometimes deadly. Sometimes even jumping on the heads of enemies is a viable strategy when the level design presents the opportunity. But as I keep saying, you have to consider the fact that to finish the level you must kill all the enemies. This mechanic puts a huge restriction on how you piece together your solutions for the levels. So even though a direct route to the end goal may be possible, if you're not given the opportunity to free the area of demons, then that route is useless. As such, you're constantly breaking down each part of a level, trying to find a way to kill the demons and get to the goal in as little time as possible. Small changes like reducing the amount of time spent collecting weapon cards or some long-range sniper shots can make a drastic difference on level times. Now, let's take a look at a level and see if we can break down one potential evolution of a player's route as they try to fine-tune every aspect of their run. For this example, we'll use the level Purify, which is fairly early on in the game. The intended developer route is pretty simple. You grab the discard ability of the assault rifle to fire a grenade at this door, blasting it open. Grab the next rifle, blow up these enemies, shoot this guy, blow up these guys, then touch the exit. Pretty straightforward. So how might we adjust this path to be faster? Well, first of all, a pretty clear change we can make is instead of blowing up this door and slowly jumping the gap, we could instead use our grenade to fly through this hole above. This is a small time saver, but it's a good start. Now, instead of going through this tunnel, which seems to waste a lot of time, what if we use the grenade killing the first group to propel us towards the goal? This is a lot trickier to pull off, but it should save us a few seconds. Now, we're at a respectable time for this mission, but we could go even further. Instead of jumping through this hole, let's just instead skip this entire first section and land on the water outside the map. Water comes with a pretty significant speed increase, so now we're zooming through the level. As you can see, through experimentation, we've come up with a significantly faster, albeit trickier route. This is just scratching the surface of what type of theory crafting you can do for this game. I chose a relatively simple level as to not spoil the fun of discovering the more complex routes in the later game. So the number of variables here is actually pretty low compared to later levels, and yet despite that, we found plenty of places to optimize our time. So now that we've looked at the puzzle solving side of the game, let's break down the moment to moment gameplay. In a game like Neon White, every millisecond counts, so you need to be able to move through the levels with grace and speed in order to score great times. First, you have to have the skills to even pull off an optimized route, but once you got that down, you've then got to do it better than every other runner who's also following the same path. It's not uncommon to be grinding down the literal milliseconds off your record. Every gunshot, turn, jump, and discard have to be timed just right to maintain your momentum. It's important to get a feel for how the characters move in the game. Knowing small details, like it's faster to move in a straight line whenever possible, can give you a competitive edge over your opponents. And it's crucial to master each of the weapons in the game, as each discard ability has its own quirks and feel. Something that makes this process all the more rewarding is that Neon White lacks any form of RNG, so any mistake you make is completely your own. And since restarting the level is as easy as pushing a single key, failure never feels like much of a punishment given that it will likely take you less than a minute to complete a rerun of a course. Let's take a look at another example. This time, we'll look at another early level, albeit one with a much simpler route. This is Bounce, and its basic route can make it appear much more inviting than other levels. But don't be fooled, its simplicity also makes it one of the levels I've spent the longest time grinding on. Because there's next to no fancy tricks to pull off, so every basic movement becomes the difference between a great and bad run. So I'm going to play two runs next to each other. One I would consider a solid time and one a failure. See if you can tell the minute differences between the two. Did you notice much? If you didn't, that's fine. But those small optimizations of movements in the left clip are so important when trying to grab a new record. It really does not matter if you have the best route possibly worked out for a level. If you can't perform it to an optimal standard, then it might as well be useless in the leaderboards. These two sides of the game form a feedback loop. As you study each level, you develop new routes which further challenge your skills. Often, the more optimized the route, the harder it is to actually pull off. Then, as your skill in the game develops, you'll find yourself discovering new and more complex paths you wouldn't have even considered when you first started. So your ability to find the fastest route and your ability to take those faster routes both improve simultaneously. I really wasn't kidding when I said everything in this game just clicks together so well. And this perfect matching of ideas doesn't end at the game's gameplay. The visuals play an extremely important role in Neon White's success. For a game with fast, snappy movement, long distance enemies, and complex pathing, visual clarity is a must. Without being able to easily tell what's going on the screen at all times, things would quickly become an unintuitive eyesore. So it's a good thing that Neon White's developers have a fantastic understanding on how to make a game easily readable to the player. There are a few design decisions within this game that have clearly been made to ensure that the player is able to comprehend all the information they need at any given time while playing. For instance, the game's color palette uses simple contrasting colors in a way not unlike that of Mirror's Edge. Enemies, weapons, and points of interest clearly stand out from the rest of the environment, especially in the early levels where most structures have a simple white texture. This also works thematically for the game, as the demons' dark misshapen designs appear to corrupt the otherwise clean landscape. And the only solution to defeat said demons are the weapons, which appear in their bright, colourful forms throughout the level. They're so dedicated to giving the player visual clarity, there isn't even a first-person model for the guns when you hold them. At first, you think this is a weird decision, but it quickly becomes apparent how great it is not to have something that big take up a big chunk of the screen. These visuals alongside well played out pathing mean that the player is very unlikely to feel lost when running through a level, even on their first try. I've even gotten some pretty solid runs on my first attempts through levels, something the developers must have been confident was going to happen to a few players since they added unique dialogue for such a scenario. This clear path also makes it feel much more rewarding when you find shortcuts, as to give them that sense that you've broken through a meticulously planned route. I think it shows how fantastic this game's ability to stick to a core idea is, given that I've just spent the last 2 minutes talking about its visuals without even discussing whether I think they look good from an artistic perspective. At this point, given my raving about the game, you can probably expect my answer, but yes, I think the aesthetic is awesome. The game has this ethereal look to it. The architecture is strange and nonsensical, and everything seems to exist near each other, but also in their own separate dimensions. And the game is sure to change up its visuals every 20 or so levels to keep you from getting sick of seeing the same thing over and over again. Sometimes you'll find yourself in what appears to be ancient structures with rich vegetation, or you'll end up in a vaporwave inspired city. No matter where the game takes you, you'll be sure it's sleek, simple, and probably desktop wallpaper material. And since we're on the artistic side of things, now would be a pretty good time to talk about the soundtrack, which you've been listening to throughout this video. Man, what a phenomenal OST. Easily one of my favorites. Like the visuals of the game, it's both complementary to the gameplay and thematically fitting. Honestly, making the soundtrack for a game like Neon White sounds like a nightmare. You have to have an OST which isn't distracting or annoying even after being constantly played while a player grinds down a level's time. Normally just filling those criteria would be an accomplishment on its own, but Machine Girl went above and beyond here, creating an absolute banger of a soundtrack. You'd think listening to some of these songs on repeat for over an hour as I grind down my times would make me sick of them, but they just hit as hard now as they did when I first played the game. So many of the songs are highly memorable, and yet somehow I've never once felt as though I've failed a run because I was distracted listening to a track. Music isn't one of my strong suits, so I don't think I could really do this soundtrack justice even if I talked about it for half the video. So I'll leave that to someone who's more talented than me in that department. But please, if you have no interest in playing the game, at least give the OST a go. Now I definitely have more stuff about this game I want to gush over, but before I do that, I need to address the elephant in the room. If you've seen any previous coverage on Neon White, you've probably heard that the writing can be, well...
Jesus, do I really look that sleazy to you?
Yes, but the good kind. The kind that will catch a girl's spit with his mouth.
That's enough out of you.
Yeah, it's not great. To tell you the truth, it's pretty bog standard bad anime writing. And I've played visual novels that have a lot worse dialogue than Neon White. But if you don't have much tolerance for even normal anime writing, you'll probably hate Neon White's story. Luckily all the visual novel stuff is skippable, so you're not forced to sit through it. I'd recommend giving it a go and seeing how you feel about it, since it's a nice change of pace from the back-to-back missions. The character art is pretty good, and the voice acting is really solid. But honestly, don't feel too bad if you just skip through the story. But before we move on from the story, I do have to tell you about one part of the game's writing that is really not great. Now, this is a spoiler warning, so feel free to jump to the time below to skip this part. Okay, so in this game, the main character Neon White and his friends Neon Yellow, Red, and Violet all worked for Neon Green back before they died and went to heaven. Now the game makes sure to let us know that Neon Green was a monster to these people, frequently abusing them emotionally and physically, ultimately dragging them to their graves with no regard for their livelihood. At the end of the game, you're given a choice. Forgive Green and let him into heaven, or send him to hell. If the player chooses to forgive him and send him to heaven, then you get the true ending, and everyone lives happily ever after. However, if the player decides that a man who has caused so much horrible pain as Green has does not deserve forgiveness, especially after having multiple chances to change his ways but sticking to his evil path, then you get the bad ending. God decides that White doesn't deserve to go to heaven because he didn't show sympathy for his abuser. This is obviously a pretty problematic piece of writing, and honestly, I'd say is a pretty shitty thing to put in the game. The rest of the story is just immature but harmless content, but this is just straight up offensive to a lot of people. The idea that the only way to get into heaven is to show mercy to your abuser is a pretty horrible message to send to people, and is the one major sour patch on what is otherwise one of my favourite games of all time. Still, luckily, there is a lot to love about this game, so I'm going to go back to talking about that stuff. But I did feel this part was worth mentioning, since I think it's a pretty irresponsible move by the writers. One department this game isn't lacking in is content. There is an absurd number of levels to be found here. 97 main story levels and 24 side quests to be precise. These can vary quite drastically in length, from some that can be beaten in under 10 seconds to others that are multiple minute ordeals. Still, given the replay factor that comes from each mission, you're not likely to run out of things to do in this game for a while. If you want, you could grind each level until you got a platinum medal time for each of them. Or you could go even further and grab the even more difficult red medals, which pose a serious challenge for anyone looking to 100% the game. There's also a few additional styles of playing which are worth checking out. The first is collecting the presents hidden on each level. This is a fun little bonus puzzle, and some of these can be really tricky to get, even after you find their hiding place. They're also needed to unlock the side quests, so you might as well give them a go. The side quests themselves are pretty cool because they're like main levels but more hyper fixated on one idea. Another extra thing to do are the rushes, which involve playing for a chain of levels, getting graded on your time at the end of the set. Some of these are brutal, including one challenge that requires you to beat every main mission in a row with only one life and no restarts. With all this content, it's more likely that you'll find yourself burnt out in the game before you run out of things to do. Which is why the last thing I want to touch on for Neon White is potential burnout, and how to avoid it. It feels weird giving a guide on how to experience a game, but I really do think the way you approach Neon White can drastically affect how much you engage with it. So here are just a few ways to optimize your fun while you optimize your runs. The first is to not try and rush through the story or collect every present immediately. As I've said previously, if you look at Neon White as a traditional FPS, it's not a very good one. You have to remember that this is a game about speedrunning and treat it as such. Ironically, it's okay to slow down at times and just grind through your record on one mission. Speaking of which, a great way to give the game a little bit of an extra competitive edge is to compete against your friends. I promise you, there is no greater high than hearing the pain in your friend's voice as you tell them that you've snatched the record back on a level. Something else to consider, at least initially, is to avoid using YouTube guides for levels. It may be tempting to skip straight to the best way to run a level to avoid practicing routes that are inferior, but doing so completely removes the puzzle side of the game. If you're genuinely wanting to go for a world record, then yes, of course you'll want to see what other players are doing. but I urge you to first try and form those optimal routes yourself, since the process of doing so is half the fun of the game. None of these tips are needed to enjoy the game, and how you want to experience Neon White is ultimately up to you. Just give them some consideration if you decide to pick up the game. Neon White is one of those special games we only get a few of every year. The type that isn't muddled with trying to be good at everything but great at nothing. Instead, the game is content with being almost entirely about the art of speedrunning. In a lot of ways, the philosophy of how this game was designed is reflected in how it's played. You repeat the same thing over and over again, chiseling away at any unnecessary parts or imperfections. And eventually, after a lot of hard work and dedication, you're left with an end result that you can sit back and truly be satisfied with.